2024 is going to be a big year for Polestar because the brand is going from one vehicle on sale in North America to three. And today we're taking a look at the new flagship of the Polestar brand. This is the all-new Polestar 3. If you're looking for a new Polestar that's also an SUV, but is a little bit more affordable, stay tuned because the Polestar 4 is going on sale just a few months after this model will be. And that video is going to be dropping in early July. But let's take a look at the new flagship and see, is it flagship worthy? At least until we get the Polestar 5 and 6, which are going to be significantly more performance-oriented than this SUV. Before we dive right into the 3 specifically, let's talk about some of the frequently asked questions over on our Facebook page. If you want to be able to interact with us as we are filming videos like this one, be sure and find us over there. These questions came from today while we're talking about the Polestar 3. The first one was, where is it built? Well, initially it's going to be built in China, but shortly after it goes on sale in North America, production is going to move to South Carolina. And if you want features like the upcoming LiDAR module, which will be mounted right there behind the windshield, which is going to give you expanded autonomous braking and other autonomous functionalities in the future, you want to wait until production moves to South Carolina because the models with the LiDAR are not going to be built in the factory where this model was built. Yes, it is related to the Volvo EX90. Essentially what's going on is the Volvo EX90 is the 3-row family-oriented model on this same platform. This is the higher performance-oriented model. So better performance, more focus on driving precision, handling ability, etc. And of course the Polestar logo instead of the Volvo logo. Now let's get into the 3 itself. The next thing to know about the Polestar 3 is that this is not related at all to the Polestar 4, which is going on sale around the same time and is, interestingly enough, almost the same size on the outside. The Polestar 4 is more of an SUV coupe. It has a sedan-like profile, a little bit less headroom in the 3rd row and less cargo room as well, and a different style as well. This looks a little bit more like the Polestar 2, especially when we take a look at the nose and we find this pod here where all the active safety sensors are located, and they're actually spelled out with some little diagrams in the front. That's a little bit different than the Polestar 4, which actually relies more on camera-based systems than the multiple radars that we find in the Polestar 3. The front-end design also looks a little bit more like the 2 when we're talking about the headlight design and this black stripe that runs from one side to the other. This houses the parking sensors on the outside, and it's just a decorative strip running around there. If you go to the Polestar space and you see a 3 and a 4 next to one another, you'll definitely notice the different proportions. The hood is definitely higher and longer in the Polestar 3 than it is in the 4. The hood's actually about hip height for me versus about knee height for the Polestar 4. It's quite a bit lower in the front, and that's part of why we have this aero fin right here. This helps improve the aerodynamics of the vehicle while making it look a little bit more upright and providing a little bit of extra pedestrian crash safety. The higher front end and longer hood profile is what allows us to have a larger storage area than we find in the 4, although this is not the biggest front trunk in this segment. You wouldn't be able to fit a roller bag or anything like that in here, but there is more room for charge cables, accessories, or for your fishy takeout. The 3 and the 4 are not exactly the same size. At 192.9 inches long, this is about 2 inches longer than the 4, but it's not an enormous difference. This is right around the same size as the Macan EV, ostensibly the upcoming Porsche Cayenne EV, and almost exactly the same size as the BMW iX and the Mercedes-Benz EQE. This is designed to do business with that set of competitors. Meanwhile, the Polestar 4 is priced lower than this, and it's designed to compete against something like the upcoming BMW i4X. So definitely different target customers in mind. One big difference, of course, is right back here where we have more of a traditional hatchback profile, definitely a very vertical opening rather than the more liftback or sportback design we find in the 4. The other difference is going to be in the wheel wells. The 4 gets a symmetrical tire layout, this gets a staggered tire setup, so 265 width tires up front, 295 width tires in the back. These 22-inch wheels have a very similar design to the Polestar 4 that I was able to drive yesterday, but they're actually a little different because of the tire size going on in the rear. The other thing that's different is we have an adaptive air suspension system standard in here, whereas we have a steel spring suspension standard in the Polestar 4 with no air suspension available. Part of that is due to the more luxury mission of the Polestar 3. Again, this is designed to compete with the Cayenne, the EQE, the iX, etc., whereas the other is intended to compete with the less expensive luxury entries from Europe. We also get the advantage of the air suspension's increased ride height. We get 8.3 inches of clearance standard. So if you're thinking to yourself, that looks low, It's probably because of the slinky profile of the roofline. We actually get quite a lot of ground clearance. And if you put this in its highest height off-road mode, you get nearly 10 inches of ground clearance. Be sure and sound off about the styling down there in the comment section. The 3 definitely has sort of a shooting brake kind of station wagon meets SUV vibe, especially when we take a look at the rear end styling and the roofline that drops notably towards the rear. But it has a much more vertical hatch than we find, for instance, in the Polestar 4. So that really helps improve cargo practicality. On the other hand, you'll notice that the roofline, especially here in the cargo area, is notably lower than in the mid or the front of the vehicle. And that obviously is going to drop down that rear seat headroom and cargo practicality versus a straight flat roof design, more of a traditional SUV format. And that's the biggest difference logically between this and the Volvo EX90. This has a much more sloping rear, much lower rear, and of course, no third row. We have full LED taillights back here with amber turn signals, of course, for the European market. The LED backup lights, they're really slim and right there in the middle. Polestar says that they're planning a single motor version of the 3, but at the moment you can only get this with 2 motors. 489 horsepower or 517 horsepower and up to a whopping 671 pound-feet of torque. That's enough power and torque to get this model 0 to 60 in 4.5 seconds. If you get the base model, that will stretch out a little bit to 4.8, but you get a range boost. This one is rated for 279 miles of range. The base dual motor model is rated for 315, and you can expect a single motor model to go beyond that in terms of its range figures. What's really intriguing about this drivetrain is what's going on in the back. It's not necessarily the range figure or the power figure. This is an asymmetrical motor setup where the rear motor is more powerful than the front. It's actually the way the rear motor connects to the wheels, because this has a mechanical torque vectoring axle on the back. A lot of EVs out there, they use 2 motors in the rear for mechanical torque vectoring. They just basically turn off the left wheel or turn off the right wheel, and that means that on the rear axle, you only ever get half the power when that system is functioning in that way. This system is different. It can send 272 horsepower to a single rear wheel, and that's really noticeable out on the road. Everything is powered by a 111 kilowatt hour skateboard style battery pack. About 107 kilowatt hours of that battery is usable, and charging happens right back here on the rear quarter panel. This of course has the European charge connector since we're out in Spain right now, but we're logically going to find the J3400 connector on the Polestar 3 eventually. If you buy one of these at the beginning, it's going to have a CCS connector in North America. Later, the J3400/NACS connector is coming at some point in the future, and there will be an adapter available so you can charge at Tesla supercharger stations. Behind the power hatch, we find 21.1 cubic feet of cargo capacity, plus, of course, the 1.1 cubic feet in the front trunk area. When it comes to cargo capacity, remember that not every car company measures cargo area the exact same way, so there is a bit of fudge factor going on here, and direct comparisons can be tricky. But we do get a little bit more cargo room back here than we find in a Porsche Cayenne or Porsche Macan, assuming, of course, the Germans and the Swedes are using the same measurement techniques. Under the load floor, we have almost enough room for a 22-inch roller bag, right like this one, to sit under that load floor. I actually kind of wish they had massaged that load floor area just a little bit to make some of those larger bags fit. But there's lots and lots of cargo area here, and almost enough area, I would think, to maybe put a temporary spare tire. I'm kind of surprised that there isn't that particular option here. We have a roller style cargo cover in the back, and as you can see, the cargo area is taller than the one that we find in the Polestar 4. So you could very easily line up 22-inch roller bags right like that and still close the cargo area. Going in for a closer look, you can lift up the load floor and lock it into that position, and then use these little bump outs as grocery bag holders. That's a nice touch. We also have access to that deep underfloor storage area, and we have a ski pass-through. It's not quite as practical as the 40-20 40 folding seats we find in some European vehicles, but I appreciate that extra cargo carrying touch. Under the rest of the load floor, there's also a little bit of extra storage space. Even further down the rabbit hole, I do find this a little bit of a missed opportunity because there is a fuse block right there in the middle of what could be an even larger cargo area. Over the course of my drive today, front seat comfort has been fantastic. These seats are very similar to the ones that we find in the EX90, and Volvo has long been known for having some of the most comfortable seats in the industry. My one complaint is the adjustment mechanism. They decided to reinvent, well, the seat switch wheel, I guess if you will. This is a square design with a button in the middle, and you press the button to change what the dial does, and then you rotate it around for the inflatable lumbar support there, and then we have the basic seat adjustments, tilt and seat bottom cushion, and then a different button for tilt and the lumbar support. It takes a bit of getting used to. You should also know that we now have a powered steering column, but I have to dig around in this touch screen for it. Steering wheel, there we go. And then we can use the buttons on the steering wheel to adjust the power tilt telescopic mechanism. Jumping into the back seat, this is easily the roomiest and most comfortable Polestar that they've ever built. Front seat's comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. I have gobs and gobs of legroom left. This is very easily going to be able to accommodate rear-facing child seats. Even some of those larger convertible seat designs should be absolutely no problem back here. Now, one thing you will notice is that the seat bottom cushion is relatively low to the ground, and that means that adults will find a little bit less leg support back here. When it comes to the legroom figures, this seems to be very similar to the Polestar 4, but the rear definitely feels roomier than the 4 because we get a little bit more width across the cabin in the back, notably more headroom. Sitting here in the middle seat position, I still have about 2 inches of headroom left. And if I scoot all the way over to this side of the vehicle, you can see lots and lots of room. Now, in kind of an interesting twist, the less expensive Polestar 4 is the one that gets power reclining second row seats. These are essentially fixed into place, but I find the seating position to be quite comfortable. Kind of a cute touch. This model gives you little pillows that are removable there, and we also get some neck pillows on little tethers. Also a nice touch, we get a completely flat floor in the back and a little bit of room for your feet to tuck in under the front seats, although not quite as much room as some. You can see that even with this front seat all the way back in its tracks, I still have a ton of legroom left. If you live in a cold climate where your windows are always steaming up on the inside, you're going to love this touch. Remember that Polestar is a Swedish company. We actually have defogger air vents for the rear windows integrated into that pillar. All right, let's take a look around the interior together. Obviously, there is definitely some part sharing with the Volvo lineup. We have this big glass moonroof up top, but we don't find an electrochromatic dimming option like we do find in the Polestar 4. We have height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and the front passenger, and fixed in place headrests that feature Bowers & Wilkins surround sound speakers in this particular model. There are a variety of different upholstery options in the Polestar 2. You can get wool upholstery, there's an imitation leather, you can also get Napa leather, and its animal welfare secured right there. Kind of interesting, not everybody is a big fan of the fact that that is actually printed on all 4 seats, but if you want everybody that rides in the vehicle to know that your leather was ethically sourced, then, you know, that's what that's about. Down here we find that manual extending thigh cushion for the driver and front passenger seats. Over there on the doors, we find fabric speaker grills up top, and then the Bowers & Wilkins regular speaker grill down below. Lots of premium and soft touch materials going on in here as well. Moving over to the dashboard, we find wood trim on the dashboard and air vents that you actually move around manually. That's definitely my preference. I found these a lot easier to use than the ones in the Polestar 4. We have sort of a neoprene wetsuit-like material on the top of the dash, typical soft touch injection molded materials at the bottom of the dash, and then more fabric speaker grills going on up there on top, and then sort of the classic Bowers & Wilkins focal point speaker up here in the middle of the dash. Definitely different design than we've seen before, but no less showy. In the middle of everything, we find a bigger screen than we found in the Polestar 2, but the same sort of vertical orientation rather than the horizontal orientation screen we find in the 4. Polestar has said that Apple CarPlay and Android Auto will be delivered via an over-the-air update for this system, but it's not going to be available immediately. That is one important thing to keep in mind. It does, of course, support Bluetooth integration for your smartphone. We also have things like Tidal streaming media. If you want to use the Dolby Atmos system to its utmost, you want to use something like Tidal with that lossless music. We also have the ability to download and install additional apps in the system, and of course the integrated Google Assistant right there. The software looks very similar to the Polestar 4, but there are some important differences. For instance, you cannot expand or contract this map and expand the widgets below. That's just not one of the features that they offer. We do, however, have lots of the same sort of screens that we found in the 2, where we have range and trip information, dynamic range control, instant consumption. You could check out your history right there. We have direct access to our 360-degree cameras, the front cameras, the rear cameras, and this is where you would move over to adjust the mirrors or the steering wheel, etc. I kind of wish we just had dedicated buttons for that. I've actually appreciated the blend of regular car features that we find in most Polestar models since up to this point rather. I find this software pretty easy to use, and it's one of the fastest and most responsive systems available right now. This is pretty similar to the Tesla lineup as far as when you touch an option having it respond immediately, and swapping through pages having it not have much of a delay. Although it does seem to be a little bit more, I guess, sensitive to whether your fingers are dry. I tend to have really dry fingers, and so sometimes that causes touchscreens like this to not respond quite as quickly as I might like. One touch that I find interesting is that, like some Mercedes models, we can have seat heating and ventilation going at the same time. So if you want your butt toasty, but you don't want it sweaty, you can actually do that in the Polestar 3. Down here we find the Qi wireless charging mat. We also have the ability to start the car with the key card. That's what's going on there. Over here we have the power pause button and volume control for the infotainment center. Two big cup holders right there. There is a roller style shade that we can close off, but there is just a little bit too much piano black plastic in here for my tastes. Back here we have a large center console armrest that reveals a moderately sized storage area, and then under this console area we find another storage console area with two USB-C charge ports and kind of this little storage pocket there where you can keep things clipped into place. Over on the driver's side, we have a full color heads-up display. It's a little bit smaller than the one in the 4, and then down here we have a full color LCD instrument cluster. If I put it in drive, you can see that it boots up very rapidly. That's another nice touch that I appreciate. This doesn't have the same kind of delays for system initialization that we find in many EVs. It's again a little bit more Tesla-like in that respect. So you just hop in the car, put your foot on the brake pedal, push it into drive, and then the screens instantly pop to life, which is a nice touch. This screen has a number of different views, and it is controlled via the touchpad on the steering wheel here. So this one over here controls that multifunction cluster, and you can see the touch buttons reveal what exact option you're going to choose, whether you want to change the layout or select a particular option there. And then over here on this side, these become the adaptive cruise control controls when that system is engaged. A controversial design cue that we're seeing in more and more EVs out there is what's going on over here on the driver's side. We have one set of switches for both the front and the rear windows. There is a tiny little LED there to show you that that's controlling the rear windows. Now it's controlling the front windows. This is not my preference. I would rather just have 4 window switches. It does make it a little bit confusing if you just want to open a window quickly and it's set to the wrong set. All right, everybody, let's get the Polestar 3 out on the road. The first thing you're gonna notice is that this doesn't exactly feel like the Polestar 2. Now, I can't talk about the Polestar 4 yet because that embargo lifts on a different date. But you know what? You guys can read between the lines. No adaptive air suspension, no torque vectoring axle on the back. I will let you draw your own conclusions. Also, it's about 800 to 900 pounds lighter than the Polestar 3. As a result, this Polestar 3 has a more solid, more large car vibe than the Polestar 2 for sure. I don't actually think that's a problem because the mission of this is quite different than the Polestar 2. The Polestar 2 is designed to compete with ostensibly an electric 2 series, maybe an electric 3 series at some point, and it definitely gives off a lot of BMW vibes. The Polestar 2 kind of seems like what would happen if some company needed to build a BMW, but they only had access to Volvo parts. That's what that comes across like. This, kind of sort of the same thing, but a different kind of BMW, maybe a BMW X5. This has the bigger car presence, it has the adaptive air suspension, and of course it has a whole lot of power. You know, we can't speed too much here, of course, when we're in Europe, but we can slow down a bit and then romp on the throttle. There's definitely a lot of power. In the range mode, there's a little bit of a delay as it brings that on the boil, but if I move over here to the performance mode, let's go ahead and drop that into that mode, and then we can actually firm up the adaptive air suspension as well. Things definitely feel very, very peppy, and there's a really instant power delivery that of course is classic EV. So you can decide whether you want more of a relaxed vibe or more of a performance vibe. In the performance mode, it's also going to be more aggressive at keeping that rear axle engaged. And in the range mode, in steady state travel, if we move back to there, it's actually going to disconnect the rear axle and become a front wheel drive vehicle out on the open highway. Then when the road starts winding again and you start driving it harder, it's going to reconnect it and become actually a pretty tail-happy electric vehicle. You can really feel that torque vectoring axle doing its thing back there. That's probably the one thing about the drive that surprised me the most, is how much torque vectoring it really does. If you're to drive something like a BMW X5M, that's the kind of level of torque vectoring we get in this, only at lower throttle applications. The X5M can get pretty tail happy if you're really romping on the throttle, but in sort of half to 3/4 throttle situations, it feels really neutral. This, on the other hand, definitely tends to feel a little bit more lively in the back if you're in the performance mode. Now, unfortunately, I can't do any 0 to 60 or 60 to 0 testing out here near Madrid, but I definitely expect this is going to be around 4.5 seconds, perhaps a little bit lower. Polestar has been known for underrating their vehicles, at least in the Polestar 2 lineup, so I wouldn't be surprised if this was a little bit below 4.5, but don't expect this to be Model Y performance levels of performance, because we don't have as much power in this as far as the weight is concerned. So the power to weight ratio is definitely different here. This is a relatively big and heavy vehicle designed to compete with ostensibly the upcoming Porsche Cayenne EV, the BMW, the Mercedes, etc. And it definitely has that big German car vibe. While I don't have any 60 to 0 stopping scores, we can talk about the regenerative braking feel. It's definitely very well done in the Polestar 3. Again, can't make any Polestar 4 comparisons yet because that embargo lifts a little bit later, but you can check out that video if you want to know more about that. For the Polestar 3, this comes across as very well sorted. This has an aggressive blended braking system, so it's going to regenerate the maximum power available into the battery depending on conditions, battery state of charge, etc. And they have done a pretty decent job blending the regenerative braking and the friction braking together. In some EVs, there can be this awkward delay between regenerative braking ending and friction braking starting or taking over, and we don't find that in here. If you're driving along and you're doing a moderate brake application and then you switch to a more aggressive brake application, things actually feel pretty smooth. There is just a tiny moment of delay, which is pretty natural in these systems. So one thing to keep in mind is that this is not going to feel quite as direct as a Tesla or a Rivian that does not have a blended braking system, but this is among the best. It's actually quite Porsche-like in the way that those systems are blended together. Obviously, we haven't been testing this on our usual road surfaces, so I can't talk about official cabin noise scores, but as with most EVs, it's pretty quiet in here, and definitely right in line with the direct European competition. Now, about that European competition, I would say that as far as the nature of the vehicle goes, this feels more like the Porsche or the BMW and less like the Mercedes-Benz EQE. I find the EQE and the EQS lineup to be just a little too soft, a little bit too softly sprung, etc. This comes across as a bit more engaging, but I would say I would not necessarily describe this as Porsche levels of engagement. Again, haven't driven the Macan yet, but versus something like a Taycan, the regular Macan, or a Cayenne, those feel a little bit more direct, a little bit more engaging, and Polestar is going off kind of in a slightly different direction. Down the same road, but they turned off in a different driveway. It's also a bit tricky to talk about fuel efficiency in reference to vehicles that we have been driving at home, but so far out here in Madrid, we've been averaging about 2.2 to 2.5 miles per kilowatt hour. There's been a reasonable amount of mountain climbing going on, so certainly keep that in mind. We were going from Madrid up to about 6,000 feet and then back down on the other side. Obviously, that's going to have an impact on the fuel efficiency of the vehicle. When we get this at home, I would expect it to be perhaps a little bit closer to 3 miles per kilowatt hour, but exactly how much further above that, I really don't know. Keep in mind, this is a little on the heavy side. It also is definitely blocky and boxy, so that's all going to hamper fuel efficiency versus something a little bit sleeker like a Polestar 4 or even certain versions of the Polestar 2. Keep in mind that there is now a long-range version of the Polestar 2 using the latest Polestar motors, and that model is wicked efficient. I would also expect the latest version of this, which is going to be the upcoming single motor model, to be more efficient than this dual motor version. So if you want more than 300 miles of range, you might want to check out that version. This version is ostensibly rated for 315 miles of range if you don't get the performance pack. This model does have the stickiest, most aggressive, widest tires available, and that obviously is going to have an impact on your fuel efficiency. But this still should be averaging maybe 2.6 to 2.5 miles per kilowatt hour in order to get that final range for this particular model. Bottom line, I think Polestar has done an excellent job engineering the Polestar 3. I love the way that this vehicle rides and feels out on the road. I'm not the biggest fan of rock-hard SUVs in this segment. I would probably never put this in its firmest suspension mode. In the regular comfort mode, it's very level and very stable. And that's one of the other things I was kind of surprised about. This is not just an adaptive damper system, it's an adaptive height and adaptive damper combined. In its highest height mode out on some gravel roads that we were driving on earlier where there were some, minor bumps and dips, this feels a little bit like the current generation Grand Cherokee. With this much ground clearance, I had honestly been worried that maybe this would feel like some of those first generation air springs where there was just no suspension travel at all. It's not quite that firm, definitely firmer than the regular modes, but you are getting nearly 10 inches of ground clearance. But you're also getting a very stable feel. Around the corners, we don't get much body roll, we really don't get much tip and dive. They've really done an excellent job at making sure this vehicle feels engaging, but also pretty comfortable and luxurious. One of the biggest things that impressed me during my time in the Polestar 3 is the level of refinement that we find in here, from the electronic systems to the way that it drives and feels, the steering, the suspension, etc. And that's something that we don't see in a lot of startups out there. And that's probably because even though Polestar is technically a startup, they have pulled on a lot of engineering expertise, especially from Volvo and the other members of the Geely family. And that really is a big asset to a company like Polestar. They can be startup in some of their design and UI interface levels, but they also can draw on that engineering expertise and give this that level of refinement that you'd expect in a more mainstream product. So this doesn't feel as peculiar as, for instance, the first software version in a Rivian with its air suspension did. This is really buttoned down, and this is the first air suspension that Polestar has ever made. Now let's get down to brass tacks. How much is this going to cost you? Well, the base model is going to start at $73,400 plus a $1,400 destination charge. Currently, that is going to give you nearly 500 horsepower and all-wheel drive. If you want a single motor model, that's coming later, and we don't know what the price tag on that will be like. It's always possible it could be similar to the dual motor model because we may get more standard feature content, or Polestar could target a lower starting price. My money is probably on a base single motor model coming in under $70,000, and it's possible that this could qualify for some portion of the federal tax credit because this is going to be built in South Carolina a little bit later in calendar year 2024. But initially, no qualification at all because it will be built in China. Definitely keep that in mind. If you get carried away with options like the optional LiDAR, that's a $5,000 option and it's going to be available in mid-calendar year 2025, the integrated tow hitch, etc., you could end up over $100,000 in the new Polestar 3. That may seem spendy for a brand that has so far been mainly selling Polestar 2s that are significantly less expensive than this, but it's actually quite a bit less expensive than most of the German competition. A Porsche Macan starts higher than this at $78,800. The Macan, I haven't driven it yet, but I'm going to go ahead and guess it's probably going to be a little bit tighter and more dynamic because, importantly, it is lighter than this. There are also a ton of different ways to customize your Macan. You can get custom paint colors, tons of standalone options, lots of different exterior paint colors. This is basically a sea of gray shades. There's no red color. There's only one sort of dark blue, no greens available, etc. If you want that kind of variation, you're going to have to take a look elsewhere. But be prepared to pay more. A BMW iX starts considerably higher than this at $87,250, and I don't think the BMW iX drives any nicer than this. The Mercedes-Benz EQE is a little bit less expensive than some, starting at $77,900, but the options list on the Mercedes-Benz is fantastically expensive. So be careful with the options on that EQE. It will get notably more expensive than the Polestar 3. And I have to say, Polestar has really been targeting performance driving dynamics. Even though this is very comfortable out on the road, it handles incredibly well. And honestly, it drives considerably lighter than the curb weight figures would imply. When it comes down to raw handling feel, I would take this over the Polestar 4. I think it's smoother, it's more comfortable. I love the torque vectoring rear axle. It's not as fast as the Polestar 4, and I would not be surprised if when we get these out on a skid pad, it doesn't actually handle as well as a Polestar 4, but it feels better, at least to me. I also prefer the way this feels over the BMW iX and the Mercedes-Benz EQE. But the iX has a trick up its sleeve. It's really square in the back. It's also wicked efficient. So if you're looking for electric efficiency, the iX has a slight edge here, and cargo efficiency with that big square back end, it's also going to have a bit of a bump over this. Now, in all honesty, I think the closest competitor to the Polestar 3 is not the BMW or the Porsche or the Mercedes. It's actually going to be its cousin from Volvo, the EX90. The EX90 is going to give you about 300 miles of range as well. It's going to cost a little bit more, $77,990, but it is going to give you a usable third row and a cargo area with the third row folded that is notably larger and more accommodating than the Polestar 3, mainly because the roofline is higher all the way across and it is significantly squarer in the back. Which one looks better? I think that's a matter of personal preference. I'd love to know what you think down there in the comment section below. I think the Polestar 3 is more attractive. I like the gold accents. I like the interior design a little bit better than the EX90, but there are a lot of things that are very, very similar. And refreshingly, that is one of the things that Polestar does not run away from. They actually tell you up front, this shares an awful lot with the EX90, including all of its active safety systems, the general crash structure, design, etc. So if you're looking for a vehicle with a ton of active safety and passive safety just baked right in at the beginning, you want to take a look at the Polestar 3 as well. I am so interested in the Polestar 3 that I am seriously considering getting one as our next long-term vehicle. I would love to know what you all think down there about that as well. Should we put our cash on the line and actually get a Polestar 3? And if we should, which one should we get? Should we get a base dual motor model or the performance trim? I actually love the value proposition of an absolute base dual motor model. That's the direction that I'm leaning, but I'd love to know what you all think down there. Also find us over at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Threads, X, etc., 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 all those other social media things that I have completely forgotten at the moment. Find us over at all those places. Now we'll see all of you next week. Also stay tuned because the video on the Polestar 4, that's coming up in about a few weeks.